Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tackling a topic that's so often misunderstood, but honestly, it's incredibly fascinating. We're talking about understanding autism. Now, we're going to focus entirely on the core concepts for beginners today, breaking down exactly what the autism spectrum is, and maybe even more importantly, what it isn't. But before we get into all the definitions and the data, I actually want you to try something with me. Let's get into a completely different mindset for just a second. Imagine walking into a room, just a totally normal room you enter every single day. But instantly and unavoidably, you notice the buzzing overhead. That low, persistent hum of the fluorescent lights, it's not just background noise anymore. It is front and center in your awareness. Then suddenly there's an overlapping sensation. The smell of someone's perfume hits you. And it's not just a passing scent, it's a strong, potent aroma that suddenly demands your full, undivided attention, stacking right on top of that buzzing light. Now let's add the sound of several different conversations happening all at once across the room. Add the scratchy texture of the clothes you're wearing rubbing against your skin. Imagine every single one of those details competing for your attention. Sounds, textures, sights, conversations, they are all hitting your brain at the exact same time, and you don't have an automatic filter to turn the volume down on the things that don't matter. So what if you just couldn't filter all of this out? For some people, the world isn't just loud, it's completely overwhelming. And no, it's not because they're being dramatic, and it's certainly not because they're trying to be difficult. It's simply because their brain processes raw data differently. Which brings us to our first main point. What exactly is autism? Okay, let's dive into this. Autism, or autism spectrum disorder, is fundamentally a neurodevelopmental condition. What that really means is it relates directly to how the brain develops and processes information. It influences how a person communicates, how they interact socially, how they experience sensory information, learn, and even respond to change. So at its core, it is simply a neurodevelopmental difference. Let's move right along to social and sensory processing. Human beings communicate constantly, but we rarely rely on just words, right? We're always navigating these hidden rules of human communication, things like tone of voice, body language, eye contact, and tons of unspoken social expectations. Now, for a lot of neurotypical brains, those subtle signals are processed almost completely automatically. You don't even have to think about it. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast. For a neurotypical person, there's this automatic filtering happening, where you just focus on the speaker and intuitively process their social cues. But an autistic brain, it might interpret those exact same signals completely differently. A person's tone might be interpreted way more literally. Small talk might just seem utterly confusing. And eye contact, well, instead of being this helpful social cue, all that raw sensory data pouring in from looking directly into someone's eyes can actually feel incredibly uncomfortable or just highly distracting. Because of these differences in communication, we run into a massive and, quite frankly, very harmful misconception. The idea that autistic people just don't care. I want to be absolutely clear about this based on the research. Difficulty expressing emotion in the exact way that other people expect does not mean a person lacks empathy or doesn't experience emotion. An autistic person may care incredibly deeply about their loved ones. They just might communicate that care in a way that looks a bit different from what society typically expects.
All right, next up, routines and special interests.
Let's move to see how this actually builds a foundation for daily life. Think about your average day. You wake up at 7 a.m., you take your familiar route to work, you eat the lunch you planned, you finish the day predictably. Now, when you have a brain that doesn't automatically filter out all that chaotic sensory data we talked about, a highly predictable, step-by-step routine is an absolute lifesaver. It massively reduces the mental energy required to just get through the day. Predictability literally equals comfort. But what happens when suddenly, out of nowhere, the plan changes? An appointment gets canceled, or your usual route to work is blocked off. Maybe your meal is prepared differently. For some autistic people, a broken routine like that can cause intense distress. Why? Because that predictability, the very thing that was shielding them from the chaos, has suddenly vanished. When that distress hits, or honestly, when the sensory input just gets way too high, you might see something called stimming. This refers to repetitive movements or actions that actually help a person regulate their sensory input or emotions. It might look like rocking, making certain sounds, or maybe touching specific objects. What might look a little unusual to someone else actually serves a very real, highly practical purpose for an autistic person's emotional regulation.
Another amazing way autistic individuals find regulation and immense joy for that matter is through special interests. Whether it's animals, trains, science, history, or tech, these interests provide incredible, deep focus, intense joy, extreme motivation, and real, detailed expertise. Being able to focus so deeply on something that genuinely fascinates you and remembering the tiny details that everyone else overlooks, that's not just a hobby. That can become a truly powerful, unique strength.
This brings us to rethinking the autism spectrum entirely. So, the crucial point here is completely destroying the straight line myth. Autism isn't just a simple sliding scale from a little autistic to very autistic. In reality, it's more like a broad, complex web of completely different traits and support needs. Since it's not a straight line, those traits vary wildly, and I mean wildly, between individuals. Let's clear some things up right now and bust some of the most pervasive myths out there. First off, it is not a disease you catch. It's a natural difference in brain development. It is absolutely, unequivocally not caused by bad parenting. It's just part of natural human brain diversity. And no, it doesn't need to be magically cured with some fad diet. Our goal really shouldn't be to force autistic people to behave exactly like non-autistic people. Instead, we should be adapting our environments to support them rather than demanding they completely change who they are. Now, what's really fascinating about all this is seeing just how unbelievably broad this spectrum really is. Because of that complex web of traits, an autistic person could be entirely nonverbal, or they could be highly articulate. They might need significant daily support, or they might live totally independently and not even get a diagnosis until they're an adult. They might have highly visible traits, or they might appear totally typical to you because they are physically exhausted from constantly masking their natural behaviors. The point is, two autistic people can look completely different from one another, yet both are absolutely autistic.
As we wrap up this explainer on the core concepts of autism, I want to leave you with a profound question to chew on. What if the world feels completely different from the inside? Our world is largely designed around neurotypical expectations, right? Make eye contact, ignore the background noise, just roll with the changes. But autism reminds us that there is literally no single correct way for a human brain to experience reality. True understanding really begins when we stop expecting everyone else's brain to filter the world exactly the same way ours does. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those great questions.